Hello there, I'm Caltrops. Baba Yaga is a close personal friend, and I suspect the troops might be working for the government. Tonight, I'd like to untell a myth in your society. A force that works to justify certain norms and ethics, or at least grant them the veneer of inevitability. It goes by the tragedy of the commons, and it smells like formaldehyde and a corpse yearning to rot. Of course, every society has myths. Stories which explain away fears and inconsistencies. And in your society, the most respected myth builders are scientists. Which is fair, because their methods have a good track record of producing results. The same observations are repeatedly expressed if the rituals are performed with precision. Scientists are respected myth builders, even when working outside their field of expertise. And if that myth props up some authority on particularly poor footing, such as landlords or colonizers, it will be seized upon, even if the consensus amongst other scientists contradicts the claim. The tragedy of the commons is one such prop. A work of ecologist Garrett Hardin published by the journal Science in 1968. It has since become one of the most cited scientific papers ever. But if you've never heard of it, good. To untell a myth, I must start with its end. This fable concludes with a moral lesson that property managed by a community is the bad property, and that property managed privately is the good property. Specifically, common property always brings about resource depletion as individual community members compete in a struggle to maximize their personal production. Or, at least, that's how it's taught in schools. In Hardin's own words, using common pasture as an example, adding together the component partial utilities, the rational herdsman concludes that the only sensible course for him to pursue is to add another animal to his herd, and another, and another. But this is the conclusion reached by each and every rational herdsman sharing a commons. Therein is the tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit, in a world that is limited. This is one example of many so-called commons Hardin brings up to justify a particularly ghastly worldview. His solution, and the solution employed throughout the history of capitalism, was of course to turn the land over to private hands at the exclusion of others, using whichever methods produced the desired results. This simple process is called enclosure. There are numerous issues with enclosure, and perhaps even more with its justifications, and particularly Hardin's justifications. I'm actually not going to engage the core thesis all that much, for now, that core being the ethical argument. Mostly I'll focus on the part of the thesis people care about when they want to look scientific. People being teachers, vloggers, economists, and other hacks. But, firstly, the conceptual problems of the terrain on which this debate takes place must be tackled. Such as, what is the scope of Hardin's thesis? How internally consistent are his logical arguments? I guess I've got the notion that it would be too easy to show where he's wrong empirically. Again, for now. It will soon be apparent that Hardin's examples of different commons produce quite a mess. So, to aid us, I think it would help to first contrast a few definitions used by Hardin's detractors. The end result should be a clearer image of the ways in which his examples of common property are dissimilar. The first two definitions are these supposed opposites: private and common. Private property, a resource held by an individual or corporation. This involves the right to exclude others from using the resource and regulation of its use. communal or common property, a resource held by an identifiable community of users, who can exclude others and regulate use. Examples given include certain shellfish beds, rangelands, forests, irrigation, and groundwater. Additionally are two other definitions which may help. State property, a resource in which the state controls access and level of exploitation. And non-property, or open access, a resource without well-defined property rights, so that access is free and open to all, as with ocean fisheries of the last century. It should be noted that Hardin's use of the word commons encompasses the realm of open access. Maritime nations still respond automatically to the shibboleth of the freedom of the seas. Professing to believe in the inexhaustible resources of the ocean, they bring species after species of fish and whale closer to extinction. This conception of common property as open access is not too strange. It's how most people use the word casually. But a paragraph down, Hardin describes state property as potentially a commons, and suggests it be privatized, which fortunately has never led to resource abuse. Though he is convinced that if state property can be less accessible to citizens, tragedy may be avoided. On the crowding of national parks, he has this to say: "What shall we do? We have several options. We might sell them off as private property. We might keep them as public property, but allocate the right to enter them. The allocation might be on the basis of wealth by the use of an auction system. It might be on the basis of merit as defined by some agreed-upon standards. It might be by lottery, or it might be on a first-come, first-served basis administered to long queues. These, I think, are all the reasonable possibilities. They are all objectionable, but we must choose, or acquiesce in the destruction of the commons that we call our national parks." He even occasionally viewed private property as common property. "There is almost no restriction on the propagation of sound waves in the public medium. The shopping public is assaulted with mindless music, without its consent. And advertisers muddy the airwaves of radio and television, and pollute the view of travelers. We are a long way from outlawing the commons in matters of pleasure." He also held the view, in a reverse way, the tragedy of the commons reappears in the problems of pollution. Here it is not a question of taking something out of the commons, but of putting something in. Sewage or chemical, radioactive, and heat waste into water, noxious and dangerous fumes into the air, and distracting and unpleasant advertising signs into the line of sight. Clearly, for Hardin, the commons were less a mode of rights and property, and more a demon stalking humanity. The inherent logic of the commons remorselessly generates tragedy. Most important to Hardin was the commons known as the gene pool. "Freedom to breed is intolerable," Hardin wrote. Yes, it was all about eugenics and population control this whole time. But supporting eugenics does not make someone automatically wrong about everything. I'm sure Hardin knew lots about Drosophila and all that jazz. For now, the purpose of his essay is beside the point, and that point is, Hardin's definition of commons lacks clarity. Unfortunately, you can't let yourselves off so easily either. The word commons carries baggage. Specifically, when the word has been removed from the context of the property system it originally described, the English commoning economy, which I shall talk about in length. In anthropologist George Appel's Hardin's Myth of the Commons, Tragedy of Conceptual Confusions, much of the essay is dedicated to illustrating that the general conception of common property more broadly is tainted with the biases of your present social system, which positions property as a commodity or simply as a resource to extract value from, Most dictionaries even remove the concept of community from their definitions, instead distinguishing common property by their multiple users. Appel provokes us to move away from trying to force your beliefs into contexts where they oversimplify and distort the social systems of people who would find your preconceptions alien.
To shift the focus of the arguments from an elitist neo-colonialist dialogue based on an externally imposed rationality to research on the internal rationality of indigenous property systems.
Going on to say that when searching for the property mode most suitable for sustaining a given community,
the concepts of private property, common property, and state property are not precise enough to provide a definitive answer, and they should be used with caution if not in fact discarded.
So, going forward, we must examine not simply the supposed modes, but rather investigate the local lattice of rights acknowledged in any given arrangement. Understanding how non-capitalist societies worked in the past will lend you a hand in building fresh spaces of autonomy, which provide for your community and allow your retreat from the old world. Capitalism has faced many hurdles in integrating the productive capacity of the planet into a single economic system, and that struggle continues. But one of its first big hurdles was the historical British Commons. Alright, so now for the empirical stuff. The crux of the tragedy centers around Gary Harry's assumption that the commons of pre-industrial and early industrial England were maintained for the profits of the commoner. Gerber imagined each who worked the land as an entrepreneur, because ideology, I guess. To Garrett Hardin for eugenics, a commoner as a rational being seeks to maximize his gain, meaning each man is locked into a system which compels him to increase his herd without limit in a world that is limited. Obvious to most people who aren't capitalism apologists is that commoners weren't inebriated by a compulsion to compete against each other to be the most profitable peasant. They worked together for subsistence in an economy characterized by A. Peasant families tending strips of land allotted to them in open fields, B. Crop rotation, C. Access to the wasteland, and D. Pasturage of animals on common lands, which is to say, upon wasteland, common meadow, and the open field after harvest. Joanne Thirsk makes the important distinction that a regulating body must also be present for it to truly be a classic commons economy. This would have been an assembly of the village, or a court of commoners operating on the Lord's manor. Similarly, parish land was administered through assemblies and churches. These characteristics did not evolve together. Likewise, different villages had different practices depending on local circumstances. So the commoning economy would not be present everywhere at once. Dwelling on how the components of this economy developed is worthwhile in understanding how they functioned. Firstly, it should be noted that harvest from open wilderness was an ancient practice, and so too was cooperative agriculture. But the specific arrangement of the English open fields method did not develop until some time later in the first millennia. It's hard to know exactly when. Prior to the adaptation of open fields agriculture, there was the Roman method. Plots were characteristically rectangular and enclosed, and not very productive. There wasn't a lot of writing between the Roman withdrawal in the 400s AD and the Norman invasion of 1066 AD, and even then after, documentation is scarce and vague. The question then is why it developed. This was partially a factor of geography. Northern Europe's soils are dense and full of clay, so lightweight plows developed for the Roman Mediterranean's looser soils proved inadequate. It would happen that England remained incapable of supporting intensive agriculture throughout Roman occupation, with the exception of sheep. But after the Romans faded to memory, a new variety of plow was introduced, the Karuka, invented somewhere on the mainland. This was a heavy wheeled plow made of iron. The plow not only buried the weeds, but also brought up to the surface a lower soil level in which percolating water tended to concentrate plant nutrients, thus dramatically changing the kind of economy which was possible in England. Importantly, the Kuruka's weight meant that it requires a hefty number of oxen, more than a solitary peasant could provide food for over the winter, naturally incentivizing cooperation. The long strips of land were characteristic for the simple reason that the plow was hard to turn around, incentivizing an economy of scale. One's holdings were scattered throughout the field, which seems inconvenient, though it allowed for everyone to work under similar conditions, and whenever crop rotation came to be used, renting land throughout the field meant that even if some of your holdings were marked for fallow that year, you could still have some land designated for cultivation. Speaking of which, the characteristic of the commoning economy which developed latest was crop rotation, or at least indisputable evidence of crop rotation. When it's clear that fields are divided, almost as if for crop rotation, it's sometimes done in a confusing fashion. In Warwickshire, for example, as many as 7 divisions of the field could be recognized in the same township, which is pretty excessive for crop rotation, and so hardly makes a good case for it having been used. The land which was administered on the manor of the local lord, the lord's domain, was more typically divided into 3 plots, which certainly does suggest crop rotation, but without documentation, it's impossible to be certain. The stricter regulations, and thus greater abundance of documentation, started to appear in the 16th century and became more explicit than after. Early manorial courts seem to have been less concerned with regulating activity of peasants, and more about sanctioning those who damaged property. What we can take away from this is that the peasantry managed just fine without lords, or even written documents. Government organization of production is more characteristic of modern economies. Contrary to what Hardin might have expected, the peasantry was capable of stinting the number of grazing animals on meadows and pasture, and even then, some commons weren't stinted at all. This was often the case in the fens, which flooded in the winter, but became vast grasslands in the summer. Local conditions may affect a variety of practices, as well as the politics of those residing upon any given commons. Some common pastures and wastes would be worked by multiple towns, or even whole counties. Some land was tilled in cooperation amongst neighbors, but not whole villages, and were thusly not properly part of the commoning economy. Some commons were scarcely regulated, others regulated strictly. Some commoners undertook enclosure themselves, whereas some fiercely resisted enclosure. Where land was abundant, enclosure was tolerated. Additionally, the commoning economy may have come and gone with fluctuations in population. To commoners and others around the world who built economies intimately tied to the land, nothing was more important than preserving that land. Time and again, this was achieved by those who knew the land best. Thank you for watching. There is going to be a part 2, which will cover the history of enclosure in England, and also go on a little bit more about Garrett Hardin. Please like and subscribe, whether or not you liked it, because it's fun to participate in the spectacle. It's fun to ever so subtly control the algorithm. It's fun being in a society. Dream well and good night.